In early 1942, just weeks after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, America had been thrust into World War II, and the nation was scrambling to find effective ways to strike back at Japan. The psychological and strategic situation was dire. The United States needed innovative approaches to prosecute a war across the vast Pacific Ocean against a determined enemy. Enter Lytle S. Adams, a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania with an inventive mind and connections in unusual places. Adams was no ordinary dentist. He was a creative thinker who had previously patented various inventions and had friends in high places, including Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. During a vacation trip to the Southwest, Adams visited Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, where he witnessed an extraordinary natural phenomenon: millions of Mexican free-tailed bats emerging from the caves at dusk in massive swirling clouds. The sight was breathtaking, with countless bats darkening the sky as they departed on their nightly foraging flights. As Adams watched this spectacular display, an unusual idea began to form. He knew that Japanese cities were largely constructed of wood and paper, materials highly vulnerable to fire. He also knew that bats were small, numerous, could carry lightweight payloads, and had an instinct to roost in dark spaces within buildings during daylight hours. What if these creatures could be turned into tiny arsonists? The concept was audacious. Equip millions of bats with small incendiary devices, transport them to Japan, release them over cities at dawn, and let nature take its course. The bats would naturally seek shelter in the attics, eaves, and crawl spaces of buildings throughout the urban landscape. At a predetermined time, the incendiary devices would ignite, starting thousands of simultaneous fires across an entire city, fires that would be impossible for firefighters to combat effectively. Adams became consumed with this idea. He spent weeks developing the concept, considering the logistics, and preparing a detailed proposal. Then, using his connection to Eleanor Roosevelt, he managed to get his idea in front of the White House. Remarkably, Adams's proposal didn't end up in the circular file. Instead, it received serious consideration at the highest levels of government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself reviewed the concept and was intrigued enough to pass it along to the National Defense Research Committee with a note that read, "This man is not a nut." That presidential endorsement, however qualified, was enough to set the wheels in motion. The military and scientific establishment began to seriously evaluate whether bat-based incendiary warfare was feasible. The Chemical Warfare Service was tasked with developing the program, which was given the code name Project X-Ray. What made the idea appealing to military planners? Several factors contributed to its serious consideration. First, conventional bombing campaigns against Japan were proving expensive, dangerous, and of limited effectiveness in early 1942. American bombers faced tremendous distances, dangerous weather, and fierce resistance. Any alternative approach that could inflict damage without risking expensive aircraft and trained crews was worth investigating. Second, the vulnerability of Japanese urban construction made incendiary attacks particularly promising. Intelligence reports confirmed that Japanese cities contained vast swaths of wooden structures packed closely together. A single strategic fire could devastate entire neighborhoods. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had demonstrated this vulnerability. The subsequent firestorms killed over 100,000 people and destroyed huge portions of Tokyo. Third, bats offered unique advantages as delivery vehicles. They required no training, no mechanical maintenance, no fuel, and no complex navigation systems. They would automatically disperse across a wide area and hide themselves in the most vulnerable parts of structures. Millions were available for capture, and they could be transported in a dormant state by cooling them to induce hibernation. Finally, there was a psychological dimension. A bat bomb attack would be terrifying and seemingly supernatural to civilian populations. Thousands of simultaneous fires erupting throughout a city with no apparent source would create panic and undermine morale. With official backing secured, Project X-Ray moved into active development. The technical challenges were substantial, and solving them required genuine innovation across multiple disciplines. The first challenge was designing the incendiary device itself. It needed to be small enough and light enough for a bat to carry. Remember, Mexican free-tailed bats weigh less than half an ounce. It needed to be reliable, producing enough heat to ignite wood and paper with certainty. It needed a delayed ignition system that would allow time for distribution and roosting. And it needed to be attached to the bat in a way that wouldn't impede the animal's flight or cause premature escape. The solution came from Dr. Louis Fieser, a chemist at Harvard University who would later become famous for developing napalm. Fieser designed a tiny incendiary device weighing just 0.6 ounces, about the weight of 2 quarters. The device consisted of a small container of napalm gel attached to a clever time delay mechanism using a spring-loaded firing pin and a surgical wire coated in corrosive material. The delay mechanism was elegantly simple. When activated, the corrosive coating would slowly dissolve the surgical wire. When the wire was sufficiently weakened, the spring would snap the firing pin into a percussion cap, which would ignite the napalm. By adjusting the thickness of the wire coating, delays ranging from 20 to 30 minutes could be reliably achieved. Attaching these devices to bats required equal ingenuity. Researchers developed a lightweight surgical clip that could be attached to the loose chest skin of a bat without causing injury or significantly impeding flight. A short string connected the clip to the incendiary device, allowing the bomb to dangle beneath the bat during flight. The next challenge was transportation and deployment. How do you move millions of live bats to distant targets and release them in a controlled manner? The solution involved inducing hibernation through cooling. When cooled to near freezing temperatures, the bats would enter a torpid state, dramatically reducing their metabolism and allowing them to be safely packed and transported. For the actual deployment mechanism, engineers designed specialized containers. Each bomb casing would hold 26 trays, and each tray would contain 40 hibernating bats with attached incendiaries. That's 1,040 bats per bomb. The bombs would be dropped from aircraft at dawn. At a predetermined altitude of about 1,000 feet, a parachute would deploy, slowing the descent and allowing the bomb casing to open. The trays would separate and fall free, automatically deploying the warming and awakening bats, who would then fly away seeking shelter as the sun rose. The theory was that a single bomber carrying 100 such devices could deploy over 100,000 incendiary-equipped bats across a target city. Given that each bat would seek shelter independently, this would result in tens of thousands of small fires starting almost simultaneously across a vast urban area. With the technology developed, Project X-ray moved to field testing. This phase revealed both the promise and the problems of bat-based warfare. Initial tests focused on basic functionality. Could bats successfully carry the incendiaries? Would they seek shelter as predicted? Would the devices ignite reliably? These early trials showed encouraging results. The bats adapted well to carrying the lightweight devices, and their instinct to roost in dark spaces remained intact. However, the testing phase also produced some embarrassing incidents. In one notable accident at the Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico, several armed bats escaped before being properly deployed. Following their natural instincts, they roost in various buildings around the base. When the incendiaries ignited, they set fire to the structures, including a general's car and a hangar. The unintended demonstration was actually quite effective, burning the auxiliary air base to the ground and causing significant damage. While mortifying for the researchers, this accidental success actually validated the concept. The escaped bats had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They had dispersed, found shelter in vulnerable structures, and started fires that proved difficult to control. More controlled tests followed at proving grounds in Utah and California. Mock-ups of Japanese village structures were built, complete with realistic materials and construction techniques. Test releases showed that bats would indeed disperse across these targets and take shelter in attics, eaves, and wall spaces. The subsequent fires consistently ignited and spread, demonstrating the weapon's potential effectiveness. According to some accounts, a chemical warfare service report concluded that bat bombs would be more effective than conventional incendiary bombs of the same weight. The report suggested that a single load of bat bombs could start between 3,600 and 4,700 fires, compared to perhaps 400 fires from a comparable load of conventional incendiaries. Despite successful testing and apparent effectiveness, Project X-ray never saw combat deployment. Several factors contributed to its cancellation in 1944. The most significant reason was timing. The development timeline kept slipping. The original expectation was that the system could be ready for deployment by mid-1943. As development continued and testing revealed necessary refinements, that timeline stretched to mid-1944. By that point, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. American conventional bombing campaigns had become increasingly effective. The B-29 Superfortress had entered service, providing the range and payload capacity to strike Japan from distant bases. Incendiary raids using conventional bombs were already devastating Japanese cities with terrible efficiency. The need for an alternative approach had diminished. There were also practical concerns about scaling production. Deploying bat bombs on a strategic scale would require capturing, housing, and maintaining millions of bats. The logistics of this operation were daunting. Where would you keep millions of bats? How would you feed them? How would you attach incendiaries to each one? The infrastructure requirements were substantial. Additionally, the project had been transferred between different military organizations several times, from the Chemical Warfare Service to the Army Air Forces and then to the Navy. Each transfer brought new leadership, new priorities, and new skepticism. The project lost momentum and advocacy. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, by 1944 a different secret weapon program was advancing rapidly and showing tremendous promise. The Manhattan Project. The atomic bomb program was consuming vast resources and offering the possibility of ending the war with a handful of attacks rather than thousands. Decision-makers were increasingly focused on this revolutionary technology rather than unconventional approaches like bat bombs. In August 1944, Project X-ray was officially terminated. An estimated $2 million had been spent on the program, a substantial sum but modest compared to many other wartime research efforts. Though never used in combat, the Bat Bomb project offers several interesting lessons and insights about military innovation, the nature of warfare, and the moral dimensions of weaponry. First, it demonstrates the creative desperation of wartime research. When facing an existential threat, nations will seriously consider almost any idea that might provide an advantage. The mere fact that using bats as weapons received serious consideration and substantial funding reveals how thoroughly war can reshape what seems reasonable or appropriate. Second, the project shows how technological sophistication doesn't always equate to effectiveness. The bat bomb was, in many ways, a low-tech solution that leveraged natural behavior rather than complex engineering. Yet it showed promise comparable to much more elaborate systems. Sometimes biological solutions can compete with mechanical ones. Third, the story raises interesting questions about the ethics of weaponry. Is using animals as weapons more or less humane than using mechanical systems? The bats would have died in the attacks, and many suffered during testing. Yet the goal was to achieve military effects with fewer human casualties on both sides by avoiding dangerous bomber missions. Where should we draw lines? The bat bomb also exists in an interesting historical context. It was developed during the same war that saw unprecedented horrors: the Holocaust, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, and ultimately the use of nuclear weapons. In this context, weaponized bats seem almost quaint, yet they were intended to inflict massive civilian casualties through widespread urban firestorms. The bat bomb remains one of the most unusual weapon systems ever seriously developed by any military. It represents a unique moment when biological ingenuity, creative thinking, and desperate circumstances converge to produce something that seems more fiction than fact. While Project X-ray never saw combat, it wasn't entirely without impact. The incendiary technology developed for the project, particularly Dr. Fieser's work, contributed to advances in napalm and other incendiary weapons that were used extensively during and after World War II. The concept of thinking creatively about weapons delivery systems influenced subsequent military research. Today, the bat bomb story is often told with amusement, a quirky footnote to World War II history. But it deserves more serious consideration. It represents genuine innovation under pressure, raises important questions about the ethics of warfare, and reminds us that even the strangest ideas can have merit when circumstances are dire. The project also stands as a testament to the bats themselves, remarkable creatures whose natural abilities nearly made them instruments of war. The Mexican free-tailed bats of Carlsbad Caverns, whose evening emergence inspired Lytle Adams, continue their nightly flights today, thankfully unmolested by military ambitions. As we reflect on this strange chapter of history, we might consider what other unusual solutions to complex problems we've overlooked because they seem too strange or unconventional. Innovation often comes from unexpected places and unconventional thinking. The bat bomb didn't win World War II, but it remains a fascinating example of how creativity and necessity can combine to produce the extraordinary. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into unusual military history, please like this video and subscribe for more fascinating stories. What other strange weapons or unusual military projects would you like to hear about? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that truth is often stranger than fiction.